There are names that history refuses to forget, and there are names that history never learned. In the spring of 1943, a young corporal from the Austrian countryside began marking targets in a notebook that would never be officially published. By the winter of 1945, that notebook contained over 400 confirmed entries. His name was Joseph Allerberger, and the German High Command knew him as the most lethal sniper on the Eastern Front. But long before he became a ghost in the snow, he was just a farm boy who learned to kill rabbits at 200 meters with a single shot. Joseph was born in 1924 in a small village near Salzburg, where survival meant precision. His father taught him to shoot at age 7, not for sport, but for necessity. Every bullet cost money, every missed shot meant hunger. By the time Joseph turned 12, he could drop a running hare at impossible distances, using breathing techniques and angle calculations that no military academy ever taught. He learned to read wind by watching wheat fields. He learned patience by waiting for deer that never came. And he learned something else, something darker, that killing, when done correctly, felt like solving a mathematical problem. When the Wehrmacht conscripted him in 1942, Joseph was 18 years old and had never missed a target in 6 years. His instructors noticed immediately. During basic training, while other recruits struggled with iron sights at 100 meters, Joseph was placing rounds through keyholes at 300. They asked him where he learned. He said, hunting. They asked him what he hunted. He said, everything that moves. But by March 1943, Joseph was deployed to the Eastern Front as part of the 144th Gebirgsjäger Regiment. The mountains reminded him of home. The cold reminded him of winter mornings waiting for boar. But the enemy was not an animal. The enemy returned fire. The enemy had families. The enemy bled the same red he had seen 1,000 times in the snow back in Austria. And yet, when Joseph looked through his scope for the first time at a Soviet soldier lighting a cigarette 400 meters away, he felt nothing but the familiar calm of a perfect shot. The bullet struck the man in the chest. He dropped without a sound. Joseph wrote the date, the distance, and the weather conditions in his notebook. Then he moved to another position, just like his father taught him. Never stay in the same place twice. Never let them know where you are. Never let them see you as human. Within 6 months, Joseph had over 100 confirmed kills. His superiors were astonished. His fellow soldiers were terrified. They began calling him the Mountain Ghost. He never spoke about his kills. He never celebrated. He simply wrote them down, one after another, like a farmer counting harvests. But inside that notebook, between the numbers and the dates, there were small annotations that no one else ever read. Too young. Had a wedding ring. Called for his mother. By the end of 1943, Joseph Allerberger had become something the war had designed him to be, a perfect instrument of death. But the war does not care about perfection. The war only cares about consumption. And Joseph, whether he knew it or not, was being consumed. The German High Command began sending him on special assignments, single targets, high-value eliminations, officers, commissars, men whose deaths would collapse entire battalions. Joseph accepted every mission without question, not because he believed in the cause, not because he hated the enemy, but because shooting was the only thing that still made sense in a world that had stopped making sense. His regiment moved deeper into Soviet territory. The snow grew heavier, the nights grew longer, and Joseph's notebook grew thicker. But something else was growing too, a silence inside him that no amount of precision could fill. He began to notice things he had trained himself to ignore, the way a man's breath formed clouds in the cold before the bullet arrived, the way bodies stayed in the same position for days because no one dared retrieve them, the way his own hands no longer shook, no matter how many times he pulled the trigger. One evening in December 1943, after a day that added 11 entries to his notebook, Joseph sat alone in a bunker and stared at the pages. 407 confirmed kills. 407 men who would never go home. 407 families who would receive letters with words like heroic and sacrifice. But Joseph knew the truth. There was nothing heroic about what he did. There was no sacrifice. There was only distance, wind calculation, and a trigger pulled by a farm boy who had learned too well how to kill things that moved. The next morning, Joseph requested a transfer to regular infantry. His superiors denied it. "You are too valuable," they said. He asked to be rotated out. They refused. "The war needs you," they said. And so Joseph Alleberger, the deadliest sniper in Europe, returned to his position in the snow, raised his rifle, and continued doing what he had been trained to do since he was 7 years old. But this time, when he looked through the scope, he saw something different. He saw a young man, maybe 19, smoking a cigarette 400 meters away. The man was laughing at something another soldier said. He had no idea he was being watched. He had no idea that in 3 seconds his life would end. Joseph's finger rested on the trigger. The wind was perfect. The distance was measured. The shot was guaranteed. But for the first time in 2 years, Joseph hesitated. Not because he couldn't make the shot, but because he finally understood what his father never told him. Killing an animal ends its life. Killing a man ends a world. Joseph pulled the trigger. The man fell. Entry number 408. The winter of 1944 arrived with the kind of cold that made metal burn skin and turned breath into clouds of ice. Joseph Alleberger's regiment had been pushed back twice in 3 months, retreating through villages that no longer had names, only coordinates. The Soviet advance was relentless, mechanical, and Joseph's role had become purely defensive. He was no longer hunting. He was holding a line that everyone knew would eventually collapse. His notebook now contained over 450 entries. He stopped adding personal annotations. There was no point. The men he killed had become interchangeable. Shadows moving through scopes, targets existing only in the moment before they ceased to exist. But the dreams had started. Every night, Joseph saw faces he had never actually seen. Men turning toward him at the moment of impact. Men whose eyes met his through 400 meters of cold air. Men who mouthed words he couldn't hear but somehow understood. His fellow soldiers noticed the change. Joseph had always been quiet, but now he was silent. He ate without tasting. He slept without resting. He moved through the snow like something mechanical, setting up positions, taking shots, moving again. The only time he seemed alive was when he was behind the scope. And even then, there was something missing, some essential connection between action and emotion that had finally severed. In February 1944, Josef's battalion was tasked with defending a railroad junction near Kirovograd. The position was strategically worthless, but orders were orders. Joseph set up in the bell tower of an abandoned church, 3 stories above the frozen ground. From there, he could see nearly a kilometer in every direction. It was perfect. It was also a trap. The Soviet assault began at dawn. Joseph counted 87 men in the first wave. He dropped 11 before they reached cover. 12 more fell as they attempted to cross open ground. By midday, he had added 31 entries to his notebook. His rifle barrel was too hot to touch. His fingers were numb. His right eye burned from hours pressed against the scope. But he kept shooting because that's what he'd been trained to do. Then he saw the boy. No older than 16, carrying a rifle too large for his frame, running across the snow toward a destroyed truck. The boy tripped, fell, scrambled back to his feet. Joseph had him centered in the crosshairs. 800 meters, wind from the east at 15 kilometers per hour. Slight elevation adjustment. The shot was routine. But Joseph didn't fire. He watched the boy reach cover. Watched him collapse behind the truck, chest heaving, face pressed against frozen metal. The boy was crying. Joseph could see it even at that distance. The way his shoulders shook, the way he wiped his face with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Joseph moved his scope to another target. An officer, maybe 30 years old, directing troops from behind a stone wall. Joseph fired. The officer dropped, entry number 482. He moved the scope again, a machine gunner setting up position. Joseph fired, entry number 483. He moved the scope again. The boy was still there, still crying, still alive. By evening, the Soviet forces had withdrawn. Joseph's battalion had held the junction. 23 German soldiers were dead. 61 Soviet soldiers lay in the snow, most of them killed by a farm boy from Austria who had learned to shoot rabbits at 200 meters. That night, Joseph didn't write in his notebook. He sat in the bell tower, staring at the frozen battlefield below, and tried to remember the last time he had felt anything other than the recoil of a rifle against his shoulder. He couldn't. The numbness had become total. A letter arrived 3 days later. It was from his mother. She wrote about the farm, about the neighbors, about the priest who prayed for him every Sunday. She asked when he would come home. She said his father missed him. She said the rabbits had returned to the fields. Joseph read the letter twice, then burned it, not out of security protocol, not out of anger, but because the person his mother was writing to no longer existed. That boy who hunted rabbits had been replaced by something else, something that could watch a 16-year-old cry behind a truck and feel nothing but professional detachment. The German High Command awarded Joseph the Iron Cross First Class in March 1944. The ceremony was brief. An officer pinned the medal to his uniform, shook his hand and said, "You are a credit to the Reich." Joseph nodded. He didn't feel credited. He felt empty. His superiors began using him differently. Instead of defensive positions, they sent him on deep reconnaissance missions, solo operations, 20 kilometers behind enemy lines, sometimes more. His job was simple: eliminate high-value targets and disappear. No backup, no extraction plan. Just Joseph, his rifle, and a map marked with coordinates. He completed 7 missions in 2 months. Each one added between 5 and 12 entries to his notebook. Each one took him further from anything resembling humanity. He moved through Soviet-controlled territory like a ghost, sleeping in abandoned buildings, eating snow, killing men who never knew he was there. On his 8th mission, Joseph was tasked with eliminating a Soviet colonel who was coordinating artillery strikes against German supply lines. The colonel was stationed in a farmhouse 12 kilometers east of the front. Joseph spent 3 days observing the location. He learned the guard rotation. He learned the colonel's schedule. He learned that the colonel had a dog, a large German shepherd that followed him everywhere. On the 4th day, Joseph took the shot. 640 meters. Perfect conditions. The bullet struck the colonel in the temple as he stepped outside to smoke. The dog began barking immediately, running in circles around the body, refusing to leave. Joseph watched through his scope as Soviet soldiers rushed outside. Watched them kneel beside the colonel. Watched the dog continue barking, confused and terrified, until a soldier finally led it away. Joseph packed his rifle and began moving to his extraction point, but he couldn't stop thinking about the dog, about the way it stayed beside the body, about the loyalty that persisted even after death. He had killed over 500 men, but it was the image of a confused dog that finally broke something inside him. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from, and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested to know how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. By the summer of 1944, the Eastern Front had become a slow collapse, disguised as tactical withdrawal. Joseph Allerberger's regiment moved west through territories they had occupied years earlier, burning supply depots and destroying infrastructure to slow the Soviet advance. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. But no one said it out loud. Joseph's notebook had surpassed 600 entries. He no longer bothered with detailed annotations, just dates, distances, and weather conditions. The killings had become so routine that he sometimes forgot them entirely. He would check his notes and find entries he had no memory of making. Men he had killed and immediately erased from his mind. His physical condition was deteriorating. 2 years of constant deployment had left him gaunt, hollow-eyed, and perpetually exhausted. He weighed 43 kilograms less than when he had enlisted. His hands trembled when he wasn't shooting. His hearing had been damaged by years of rifle fire. He coughed blood some mornings, but never reported it. Medical discharge would mean returning home, and Joseph no longer knew what home meant. The other soldiers avoided him now, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, a recognition that Joseph had crossed into a territory they couldn't follow. He had become what the war demanded, a perfect killer devoid of hesitation, doubt, or mercy. But perfection in killing is indistinguishable from monstrosity, and his fellow soldiers understood this instinctively. In July 1944, Joseph was assigned to protect a convoy retreating through Poland. His position was a farmhouse overlooking a narrow road flanked by dense forest. Intelligence suggested Soviet partisans controlled the area. Joseph's orders were clear: eliminate any threat to the convoy. He set up in the attic, creating a firing position that offered 360 degrees of coverage. The convoy was scheduled to pass at dawn. Joseph waited through the night, rifle ready, watching darkness slowly dissolve into grey morning light. The partisans appeared at 6:47 a.m. Joseph counted 12 figures moving through the forest. They were setting up an ambush, explosives on the road, firing positions in the trees. Joseph began eliminating them systematically. First shot, 720 meters, partisan placing explosives. Second shot, 690 meters, partisan with radio. Third shot, 810 meters, partisan in tree. By the time the convoy arrived, Joseph had killed 9 of the 12 partisans. The remaining 3 fled into the forest. The convoy passed without incident. Joseph packed his equipment and prepared to move to the next position. Then he heard the crying. It was coming from the forest, near where the partisans had been operating. Joseph approached carefully, rifle raised. What he found made him stop completely. A girl, maybe 13 years old, kneeling beside the body of a man Joseph had killed, the partisan with the radio. The girl was trying to wake him, shaking his shoulders, begging him in Polish to open his eyes. She was his daughter. She had been hiding in the forest, watching her father work, when Joseph's bullet ended his life. Joseph stood 20 meters away, rifle pointed at the girl, finger on the trigger. Protocol demanded he eliminate witnesses. She had seen the direction of fire. She could compromise his position. The shot was justified. The shot was necessary. But Joseph didn't fire. He lowered his rifle and walked away. The girl's crying followed him through the forest, growing fainter with distance but never fully disappearing. That evening, Joseph made his first and only notation that broke his own protocol. Entry number 614 was marked with a single word: daughter. The German retreat continued through August and September. Joseph's missions became increasingly desperate, covering withdrawals, eliminating scouts, protecting supply lines that no longer had supplies. The Wehrmacht was hemorrhaging soldiers, equipment, and territory. The end was approaching, and everyone could feel it. Joseph's mental state deteriorated in parallel with the military situation. He began experiencing dissociative episodes, moments where he would wake up mid-action with no memory of the preceding hours. He would find himself in a new position, his rifle fired, new entries in his notebook, but no recollection of making the shots. His superiors noticed but said nothing. They needed him functional, not healthy. The distinction between the two had become irrelevant. In October 1944, Joseph was part of a defensive line near Budapest. The Soviet forces had superior numbers, superior equipment, and superior morale. The German position was untenable, but retreat required covering fire, and Joseph was the best they had. He set up in an industrial building overlooking a bridge. For 6 hours, Joseph fired continuously, changing positions between shots, creating the illusion of multiple snipers. He added 47 entries to his notebook that day. 47 men who died so that 200 German soldiers could retreat across a bridge. When it was over, Joseph's hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from fear, not from cold, but from the simple mechanical repetition of pulling a trigger 212 times in 6 hours. His body had begun to reject what his mind had accepted. That night, alone in a destroyed factory, Joseph did something he hadn't done since childhood. He prayed, not for forgiveness, not for salvation, but for the simple ability to feel something, anything other than the mechanical calm that preceded each kill. No answer came, just silence. The same silence that filled the space between his rifle's report and the moment a target fell. The same silence that had become the only constant in his life. By November 1944, Joseph Allerberger had over 650 confirmed kills. He was 20 years old, and he had stopped counting the days until the war ended because he understood something his superiors never acknowledged. The war would end, but what he had become would not. Winter returned to Europe in 1944 with a severity that old soldiers claimed they had never seen. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Supply lines froze. Vehicles stopped functioning. Men died in their sleep from hypothermia, and by morning their bodies were too frozen to bury. The Eastern Front had become a landscape of ice and death, and Joseph Allerberger moved through it like something that belonged there. His regiment had been reduced to less than half its original strength. Replacements arrived weekly, boys of 16 and 17 who had never held a rifle before conscription. Joseph was tasked with training them. The irony was not lost on him. He had become what he once was, a farm boy teaching other farm boys how to kill at distance. But Joseph was no longer a teacher. He was a ghost demonstrating mechanical procedures. Hold your breath here, adjust for wind here, pull the trigger here. The boys watched him with a mixture of awe and terror. They had heard the stories. They knew his count. Some of them asked him what it felt like. Joseph never answered. By December 1944, Joseph's notebook contained 703 entries. The number had stopped meaning anything to him. It was just data, a record of mechanical efficiency in a machine designed to destroy. But the dreams had intensified. Every night, Joseph saw the faces of men he had killed, except now they spoke. They asked him questions. Why me? What did I do? Who will tell my mother? Joseph woke every morning without answers. The German High Command issued new orders in late December. All available units were to participate in a final offensive through the Ardennes. It was called Operation Watch on the Rhine, though the soldiers had another name for it, the last desperate gasp of a dying regime. Joseph's role remained unchanged. He would provide long-range covering fire while infantry advanced through positions that intelligence claimed were lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong. The positions were heavily fortified. The offensive collapsed within days. Joseph spent 72 consecutive hours in a frozen observation post, eliminating targets as they appeared, watching German soldiers die in numbers that made counting impossible. He added 81 entries to his notebook during those 3 days. 81 men who existed in his scope for 3 seconds before ceasing to exist entirely. By the end, Joseph's vision had begun to blur. His hands were bleeding from frostbite. His right eye had developed a permanent twitch from hours pressed against the scope. But he kept shooting because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting what he had become. On the 4th day, the offensive was officially abandoned. Joseph's regiment retreated once again, leaving behind equipment, wounded soldiers, and any remaining pretense that the war could be won. The march back was silent. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. They had all seen too much, done too much, lost too much. Joseph walked at the rear of the column, rifle across his back, notebook in his pocket. He tried to remember what his father's face looked like. He couldn't. He tried to remember the smell of his mother's cooking. He couldn't. He tried to remember what it felt like to shoot a rabbit and feel something other than mechanical satisfaction. He couldn't. In January 1945, Joseph's regiment was stationed in a small Austrian village, less than 200 kilometers from where he had grown up. He requested 3 days' leave to visit his family. His superiors approved. "You've earned it," they said. Joseph walked the final 30 kilometers to his family's farm. It took him 2 days. When he arrived, his mother opened the door and didn't recognize him. Joseph had to say his name 3 times before she understood. Then she collapsed against him, crying, repeating his name over and over. His father emerged from the barn. The old man looked at Joseph for a long moment, then nodded once. No embrace, no words, just recognition of what Joseph had become and acceptance that some transformations cannot be reversed. They sat at dinner that evening. Joseph, his mother, his father, his younger sister. His mother asked him about the war. Joseph said nothing. His father asked him about his regiment. Joseph said nothing. His sister asked him if he'd been shooting. Joseph looked at her and said, "Yes." That was the last word he spoke for the remainder of his visit. On the 3rd day, Joseph's father took him to the fields where Joseph had learned to hunt as a child. They walked in silence until they reached the spot where Joseph had killed his first rabbit at age 7. His father stopped and pointed to the tree line, 600 meters away. "Do you remember?" his father asked. Joseph nodded. "Do you remember what I told you that day?" Joseph shook his head. "I told you that killing is easy. What's hard is knowing when to stop." Joseph looked at his father. The old man's eyes were sad, ancient, filled with an understanding that required no explanation. "I don't know how to stop," Joseph said. His father nodded. "I know." "Duff." They stood together in the field for an hour, neither speaking, both understanding that the boy who had left this farm in 1942 would never return because that boy no longer existed. In his place stood something else, a mechanism designed for a single purpose, now obsolete but unable to deactivate. When Joseph returned to his regiment, his notebook contained 703 entries. By the time the war ended 4 months later, it would contain over 800. But on that day in January 1945, standing in the field where he learned to kill, Joseph Allerberger made a decision. He would finish what he had started. He would kill until the war ended, or until he died. But he would never again pretend that what he did was anything other than what it was. The systematic destruction of human life by a man who had forgotten what human life meant. The war had made him its perfect instrument, and perfect instruments do not question. They simply function until they break. The final months of the war unfolded like a slow-motion collapse. The Third Reich contracted day by day, kilometer by kilometer, until what remained was a ghost empire defended by children and old men. Joseph Allerberger's regiment moved constantly, never staying in one position more than 48 hours, always retreating, always leaving behind more dead. By March 1945, Joseph's notebook had exceeded 800 entries. The number had become abstract, so large that it no longer corresponded to anything real. 800 men, 800 lives. 800 worlds erased by a farm boy from Austria who had learned too well how to kill things that moved. His physical condition had deteriorated beyond recognition. He weighed 57 kilograms. His uniform hung on him like a scarecrow's clothes. His face had become a skull wrapped in grey skin. His hands never stopped trembling. His cough produced blood every morning, but his shooting remained perfect. That was all that mattered. The Wehrmacht had stopped pretending the situation was salvageable. Orders became increasingly desperate and contradictory. Hold this position. Retreat immediately. Destroy everything. Preserve civilian infrastructure. The command structure was disintegrating, and with it, any remaining illusion of military discipline. Joseph's role simplified. He was no longer assigned specific missions. He simply moved with his regiment and killed anyone who threatened it. Soviet soldiers, partisans, deserters. The distinctions had stopped mattering. Anything that moved and carried a weapon became a target. In early April, Joseph was positioned in a church tower overlooking a crossroads near Vienna. His orders were to prevent Soviet forces from advancing through the intersection. He spent 4 days in that tower, leaving only to relieve himself and drink from a rainwater barrel. He added 63 entries to his notebook. On the 5th day, a young German soldier appeared in the tower. He was maybe 17, still wearing a Hitler Youth uniform because proper military equipment had run out. The boy's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle. He looked at Joseph and asked, "Is it true you've killed over 800 men?" Joseph nodded. "How do you do it?" Joseph looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he said, "You stop seeing them as men." The boy stared at him, waiting for more. But there was nothing more to say. That was the entire technique, the complete methodology, the total sum of what Joseph had learned in 3 years of killing. Dehumanize the target, reduce life to geometry, pull the trigger. The boy left the tower without another word. Joseph never saw him again. By mid-April, the Soviet forces had encircled Vienna. Joseph's regiment was ordered to break through the encirclement and retreat west toward the American lines. The logic was simple. Surrender to the Americans meant prisoner of war camps. Surrender to the Soviets meant execution. The breakout began at midnight. Joseph provided covering fire from a building overlooking the main route. For 6 hours, he shot continuously, methodically eliminating Soviet soldiers who attempted to close the corridor. He added 41 entries to his notebook that night, 41 men who died so that 300 German soldiers could escape encirclement. When dawn came, Joseph's rifle barrel was too hot to touch. His right shoulder was bruised black from recoil. His ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear, but he had accomplished his mission. The corridor had remained open. His regiment had escaped. Joseph packed his equipment and prepared to follow the retreating column. But as he left the building, he saw something that made him stop. A Soviet soldier, badly wounded, sitting against a wall 15 meters away. The man was holding his stomach, trying to stop the bleeding. He looked at Joseph. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Joseph raised his rifle. The man didn't flinch. He just kept looking at Joseph, waiting, accepting what was about to happen. Joseph's finger rested on the trigger. The distance was trivial. The shot was guaranteed. Protocol demanded he eliminate the witness. The man had seen his face. He could identify him. The kill was justified. But Joseph lowered his rifle and walked away. He didn't know why. He couldn't explain it. He simply couldn't pull the trigger. Behind him, the Soviet soldier remained sitting against the wall, bleeding slowly, watching the German sniper disappear into the smoke. If this story surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. Joseph's regiment moved west for 3 weeks, sleeping in forests, stealing food from abandoned farms, avoiding Soviet patrols. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. The radio broadcasts had stopped. The supply drops had stopped. The orders had stopped. They were a ghost army wandering through a dead empire. On May 5, 1945, Joseph's regiment encountered American forces near Salzburg. The Americans accepted their surrender without incident. Joseph handed over his rifle, his ammunition, and his notebook. An American officer flipped through the pages, reading the entries. He looked at Joseph and said in broken German, "How many?" Joseph answered in English he had learned from captured soldiers. 807. The American officer closed the notebook and handed it back. "Keep it. You're going to need to explain this someday." Joseph was processed through 3 prisoner of war camps over the following months. He was interrogated repeatedly by Allied intelligence officers who wanted to verify his count. They didn't believe him at first. 800 confirmed kills seemed impossible, but the Wehrmacht records confirmed it. The notebook confirmed it. Joseph's superiors, also captured, confirmed it. The number was real. Joseph Allerberger, a farm boy from Austria, had killed 807 men during 3 years of war. He was the deadliest sniper the European theater had ever produced. But in the camps, surrounded by thousands of former soldiers, Joseph never spoke about his kills. He never showed the notebook to anyone. He never claimed the title that Allied intelligence had given him. He simply sat in silence, waiting for the war to officially end, knowing that even when it did, something inside him never would. Joseph Allerberger was released from Allied custody in November 1946. He was 22 years old, weighed 59 kilograms, and carried a notebook that documented 807 confirmed kills across 3 years of warfare. He also carried something else, a silence so complete that even he could no longer penetrate it. The journey back to his family's farm took 4 days. He walked most of it, occasionally catching rides with farmers or former soldiers also returning home. No one asked him questions. They recognized the look, the hollowed eyes, the mechanical movements, the absolute absence of anything resembling joy or relief. He was one of thousands who had survived the war but not returned from it. When Joseph arrived home, his mother was in the garden. She looked up, saw him standing at the gate and began to cry, but she didn't run to him. She walked slowly, carefully, as if approaching something dangerous. When she reached him, she touched his face with both hands and said, "You're home." Joseph nodded, but the word home no longer meant what it once had. The farm was the same. The mountains were the same. The smell of pine and earth was the same. But Joseph was not. He was a mechanism designed for war, now deposited into peacetime with no instructions for deactivation. His father emerged from the barn. The old man looked at Joseph for a long moment, then extended his hand. They shook. No embrace. No tears. Just recognition between two men who understood that some experiences cannot be shared, only acknowledged. The first weeks were impossible. Joseph couldn't sleep more than 2 hours without waking. He couldn't eat without feeling nauseous. He couldn't be in rooms with other people without calculating angles and distances. His mind, trained for 3 years to identify threats and eliminate them, continued functioning on full alert, despite the absence of any actual danger. His family tried to help. His mother cooked his favorite meals. His sister asked him about trivial things, weather, animals, neighbors, trying to reconnect him to normal life. His father worked beside him in silence, occasionally pointing to tasks that needed completing but never forcing conversation. But Joseph had stopped existing in the present. His consciousness remained trapped in the 3 years between 1943 and 1945. During the day, he functioned automatically, feeding animals, repairing fences, clearing fields, but his mind was elsewhere, reliving shots, recounting distances, seeing faces that no longer existed, except in the notebook he kept hidden in his room. At night, the dreams intensified. 807 men appeared in sequence, one after another, each asking the same question. Why me? Joseph would wake, gasping, drenched in sweat, unable to separate memory from nightmare. He never told his family about the notebook. He never told them about the number. They knew he had been a sniper. They knew he had killed, but they didn't know the scale. And Joseph understood instinctively that if they ever learned the full truth, the fragile connection between them would break completely. In January 1947, Joseph tried to return to hunting. His father suggested it, thinking perhaps the familiar activity might help. They walked together to the fields where Joseph had learned to shoot as a child. His father pointed to a deer standing 200 meters away. Joseph raised his rifle and couldn't fire. His finger froze on the trigger. His breath stopped. His vision blurred. He lowered the rifle and handed it to his father without explanation. He never attempted to hunt again. The local priest visited in February. He had heard Joseph had returned. He came with good intentions, offering prayer, communion, absolution. Joseph sat through the visit politely, answering questions with single words, nodding at appropriate moments. When the priest asked if Joseph would like to confess, Joseph said no. "God forgives all sins," the priest said. Joseph looked at him. "I don't want forgiveness." The priest left confused. Joseph didn't explain. How could he? The priest lived in a world where 807 murders required 807 confessions. Joseph lived in a world where 807 confirmed kills was simply data recorded in a notebook and verified by military documentation. Spring arrived. The farm began to recover from years of neglect. Joseph worked from dawn until exhaustion forced him to stop. Physical labor was the only thing that quieted his mind. As long as his body moved, his thoughts stayed manageable. But the moment he stopped, the silence returned. That terrible internal silence filled with questions that had no answers. His mother noticed the change. One evening, she sat beside him on the porch and said, "You don't have to carry this alone." Joseph said nothing. "Whatever happened over there, whatever you had to do, it wasn't your fault." Joseph looked at her. She meant well. She was trying to help, but she didn't understand. Fault required choice. Fault required alternatives. Joseph had made 807 conscious decisions to pull a trigger, and each decision had been the correct one according to the logic of war. "I was good at it," Joseph said quietly. "That's the problem." His mother didn't respond. What could she say? Her son had been selected by history to be perfect at something terrible, and perfection requires no forgiveness because perfection admits no error. By summer, Joseph had developed a routine that allowed him to function. He woke at 4 a.m., worked until exhaustion, ate mechanically, slept in short intervals, repeated. He spoke only when necessary. He avoided the village. He refused all invitations to social events. He existed in a carefully constructed isolation that kept the 807 ghosts at a manageable distance. But one evening in August, Joseph's sister found the notebook. She was cleaning his room and discovered it hidden beneath the floorboards. She opened it, read the first page, and understood immediately what she was looking at. 807 entries, 807 dates, 807 distances, 807 annotations written in her brother's careful handwriting. She brought the notebook to Joseph. He was in the barn, repairing a fence. She held it out to him and said, "Is this real?" Joseph took the notebook. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at his sister. She was 19 years old. She had spent the war on the farm, protected from the reality Joseph had inhabited. Her hands were clean, her conscience was clear. And Joseph understood that the distance between them was not measured in kilometers, but in the 807 lives that separated her world from his. "Yes," Joseph said. His sister's face changed. She looked at him differently now, not with fear, but with a sadness so profound that it transcended words. She turned and walked away without speaking. Joseph never saw the notebook again. His sister destroyed it that evening, burning it page by page in the fireplace. She didn't ask permission. She didn't tell anyone. She simply erased the physical evidence of 807 confirmed kills, hoping that perhaps without the documentation, her brother might finally forget. But Joseph didn't need the notebook. Every entry was permanently recorded in a place no fire could reach. And on the night his sister burned those pages, Joseph stood in the barn and recited all 807 from memory, whispering names he had never known and dates he would never forget. The war had ended. But the counting never would. Joseph Allerberger lived 71 more years after the war ended. He never married. He never left Austria. He never spoke publicly about his service. For 7 decades, he existed in the shadow of 807 deaths, carrying them with the same silent precision he had once used to deliver them. The farm provided structure. Joseph worked the land with the same methodical efficiency he had once applied to killing. He planted crops in straight lines. He repaired equipment with mathematical exactness. He tended animals with mechanical consistency. His neighbors saw a quiet man who kept to himself. They didn't see the ghost who couldn't stop counting. In the 1950s, as Austria rebuilt itself, former Wehrmacht soldiers began writing memoirs, attending reunions, claiming brotherhood in shared trauma. Joseph was contacted several times by former members of his regiment. They wanted him to attend gatherings. They wanted him to share stories. They wanted him to validate their experience by confirming his legendary status. Joseph declined every invitation. He understood what they wanted: absolution through collective memory, redemption through shared responsibility. But Joseph had spent 807 moments in perfect isolation, making 807 individual decisions, pulling 807 separate triggers. His experience was not collective, it was singular, and it was not shareable. The nightmares never stopped. They evolved. In his 30s, Joseph dreamed of the men he had killed, standing in a line that stretched to the horizon, waiting their turn to ask him questions. In his 40s, he dreamed of himself as a boy of 7, shooting his first rabbit, except the rabbit had a human face. In his 50s, he dreamed of his own death, shot at 800 meters by a sniper he never saw. He woke from these dreams without emotion. Fear had been replaced by familiarity. The dead had become his most constant companions, more present than his living family, more real than his waking life. In 1963, a journalist discovered Joseph's identity and published an article identifying him as the deadliest sniper of the European theater. The article was sensational, filled with speculation and exaggeration, but the core facts were accurate. 807 confirmed kills, 3 years of continuous service, survival against impossible odds. The publication changed nothing for Joseph. He refused all interview requests. He made no public statements. The journalist wrote a follow-up article expressing disappointment that the legendary sniper had become a reclusive farmer who refuses to discuss his service. Joseph read the article once, then he used it to start a fire in the wood stove. His mother died in 1971, his father in 1978. His sister moved to Vienna in 1982 and stopped visiting. Joseph inherited the farm completely and lived there alone, working the land, maintaining the buildings, existing in a routine so rigid it bordered on ritual. The only change came in his 70s, when Joseph's body finally began to fail. Decades of malnutrition, untreated medical conditions, and physical trauma compounded into systemic collapse. His hands, which had once held a rifle steady at 800 meters, could no longer grip a tool. His eyes, which had once identified targets through impossible distances, could no longer read by lamplight. But his mind remained sharp, continuing to count, continuing to remember, continuing to relive 807 moments of perfect precision and complete horror. In 2007, at age 83, Joseph was contacted by a military historian researching Eastern Front snipers. The historian had accessed Wehrmacht records and verified Joseph's count through cross-reference documents. He wanted to interview Joseph for a book. Joseph agreed. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he decided to speak. Not for redemption, not for recognition, but perhaps because after 62 years of silence, he understood that silence had changed nothing. The interview took place in Joseph's kitchen. The historian set up a recording device. Joseph sat across from him, hands folded, face expressionless. The historian asked his first question: "Can you describe what it felt like to have your first confirmed kill?" Joseph thought for a long moment. Then he said, "Like solving a problem." "And your 100th kill?" "The same." "And your 800th kill?" "Exactly the same." The historian stopped the recording. He looked confused. "Didn't it change you? Didn't you feel anything?" Joseph looked at him. "I stopped being the person who feels things in 1943. Everything after that has just been aftermath." The interview lasted 6 hours. Joseph spoke with clinical precision, describing techniques, conditions, protocols. He explained wind calculation, elevation adjustment, breathing control. He detailed the mechanics of efficient killing. But he never described emotion, never claimed trauma, never requested understanding. At the end, the historian asked one final question. "Do you regret any of it?" Joseph shook his head. "Regret requires the belief that you could have acted differently. I did what I was trained to do, what I was ordered to do, what the situation demanded. The question isn't whether I regret it. The question is what it means that I could do it at all." The book was published in 2009. It dedicated an entire chapter to Joseph Alleberger, accurately documenting his service, confirming his count, and quoting his interview extensively. The book described him as the most efficient killer the European theatre produced, a man who transformed the mechanics of death into a form of terrible perfection. Joseph never read the book. He had already said everything he would ever say. In his final years, Joseph's health deteriorated completely. He moved to a care facility in Salzburg in 2016, no longer capable of maintaining the farm. He spent his days in a chair by the window, staring at mountains that reminded him of observation posts from 70 years earlier. Visitors were rare. The few who came reported that Joseph rarely spoke. When he did, it was often numbers, dates, distances, coordinates. His mind had returned completely to the only time in his life when everything made sense, when every action had clear purpose, when the world reduced to simple geometry, distance, wind, target, trigger. Joseph Alleberger died on January 5, 2017, at age 92. His death was noted briefly in local newspapers. Former Wehrmacht soldier passes away in Salzburg, survived the Eastern Front. Never married, no surviving family. The obituary didn't mention the 807 confirmed kills. It didn't mention the notebook his sister destroyed. It didn't mention that he was the deadliest sniper Europe ever produced. It simply noted that a quiet man who worked a farm had finally stopped working. But somewhere in the mountains of Austria, in the fields where a boy once learned to shoot rabbits with perfect precision, 807 ghosts finally stopped waiting for answers to questions that have none. The war ended in 1945. The killing stopped. But the man who learned to kill at age 7 never did. Joseph Alleberger spent 71 years after the war trying to become human again. He failed. Not because he didn't try, but because what the war demanded of him, 807 individual decisions to end 807 individual lives, had transformed him into something that couldn't be transformed back. His story is not one of heroism, it's not one of tragedy, it's simply the documentation of what happens when a farm boy who learned to shoot rabbits becomes the most efficient mechanism of death a civilization at war can produce, and then survives long enough to understand what that means. The steel of his rifle is long since rusted. The notebook documenting his kills was burned decades ago. The mountains where he operated remain unchanged. But the sound of 807 shots, fired across 3 years of war by a boy who stopped being a boy the moment he pulled his first trigger, echoes still. Not in history books, not in monuments, but in the silence between what we are and what war makes us. Joseph spent 7 decades trying to escape that silence. In the end, it was the only thing that followed him home. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Joseph Alleberger. See you in the next video.